Hello. So before I begin my discussion, I just want to start with a few quick trigger warnings. The first is that I will be talking about my emotional experience as somebody who has both what is considered to be visible and invisible illness. And so if this is something you are currently struggling with, so the internalization of feelings based on how society treats you, or even just dealing with the repercussions emotionally of how society treats you, maybe go find another video and really take some time for self-care. And the reason I wanted to make a point of mentioning self-care is that we as activists do not do it nearly enough. The second trigger warning is that I will be talking about violence that both non-human and human persons face in and outside of the slaughterhouse. And by outside, I just mean in transport trucks. While I will not be discussing either of these things in any great detail, I will be talking about what non-human persons face once they're inside the slaughterhouse, and in more of a statistical list form, I will be talking about what human persons, specifically human disabled persons, face as workers in these institutions. So if either of these things feel like they are going to get at you in any way, in any degree, just like I said, go take time for yourself. So I want to begin with what disability means to me. I was originally going to start with, the general definition of disability, and then go on to ableism and etc. But then somebody pointed out to me that we all know these definitions. We don't need to hear them again. And that's why I wanted to instead go in a different direction and explain what these terms mean to me so that one can better understand the road I am going down as I continue in my studies and continue in this presentation. So disability for me is an extremely complicated concept. And this is because I am thought of as having an invisible illness as well as a visible one. And the reason I put invisible in quotations there is because I do not feel that my illnesses or disabilities are invisible. If somebody really just took the time to educate themselves and learn a little bit more about both my illnesses and about ableism in general, they would realize that there really is no such thing. And I actually find it quite offensive to have my disabilities or my illnesses be called invisible. And so even if I'm not using quotations throughout the rest of this presentation, that's just something I want to have people keep in mind. But I also want to emphasize that that is just my personal preference. If somebody else defines themselves as having an invisible disability and they're okay with that, that experience is also equally as valid. So what I mean when I say that I am viewed as both is that literally one day I can be using a wheelchair and the next day I won't be. And this provides me with both a unique perspective and a unique and complicated emotional struggle. So when I'm using my wheelchair, I experience more of, I guess, what one might think of as like the typical ways in which persons with disabilities are thought of as being discriminated against. So, not being able to get up a curb because it wasn't sloped enough, and because people can't imagine the difficulty that somebody in a wheelchair might have trying to get themselves up this tiny little step, because for them, who is walking on two legs, it's not that big of a deal. Or being gawked at or experiencing further inspiration porn. And that in itself takes its own emotional toll. You begin to feel like you are freakish, or that you aren't remotely physically attractive and therefore you don't deserve a physical sexual relationship. And so that's the way really in which this particular form of discrimination that I experience as somebody with a visible disability takes and internalizes. Now, when I'm not using my wheelchair, I'm not using my cane, I face a whole different set of problems. And these problems tend to take on more of a political form. So I have a harder time getting the accommodations that people with disabilities have been given, the little ones we have been given. So I lost my job as a result, pretty much because even though I had a doctor's note, I wasn't sick enough. And to this day, I have difficulty getting my medication I've been on for years. Even just this week, I had to fight for it because I guess I don't look sick enough, or I'm not acting sick in the right way. And the way that this emotionally internalizes, the way that this discrimination internalizes inside my emotional self, is that I begin thinking maybe I am weak and I just can't handle it, and that's why I'm undeserving of these medications or undeserving of these accommodations. And so for me, the concept of disability is the furthest thing from simple, both in an intellectual sense and an emotional sense. And therefore, ableism, understanding ableism, is far from simple. And this is why, somewhat ironically, I have come to define ableism in the simplest way I can. And that's because you cannot summarize these feelings in a simple sentence. And unfortunately, sometimes you do need those simple sentences so that you can form an argument or give a talk or help others understand. And I think that's what we all want to do with these talks that we give, is help others understand. So the definition of ableism that I have come to find fits the best is a form of bigotry that values non-disabled persons over disabled persons. And this results in their rights being lost, their bodily rights specifically is what I will be focusing on, and violence being done onto them. And the reason I like this definition is because it includes everybody, whether your illness is recognized or not, whether you have, self-diagnosed or not, whether you are getting the treatment you need or not, whether you're in a wheelchair or not, you fit into this definition. Ableism reflects the sentiment of certain groups and social structures that value and promote certain abilities over others. And the abilities that I view as being the key ones that society, for whatever reason, seems to put such an emphasis on, is the ability to walk on two legs and the ability to think or to be thought of as thinking rationally. And as you can see, this leaves out a whole host of people. It leaves out people of color, it leaves out disabled people, it leaves out non-human persons, it leaves out queer people and trans people, and the list just goes on, because really the only person it does not leave out is the human, abled, white, hetero, cis person. And if you are not that person, then you are less deserving of rights. Your body is less deserving of rights and respect, and therefore violence being done onto you becomes more acceptable. And to prove this point, I want to give a number of examples that both take place inside and outside of the slaughterhouse setting. And the reason I picked this setting specifically is that for me it really seemed to be where most obviously ableism and speciesism connect. They literally, even though we know that intersectionality is not one intersection, it's multiple, but this seems to be one of the places where that intersection is extremely obvious. And so I've chosen to focus on this for my research and the purpose of this talk specifically. So to begin, I want to talk about discrimination against non-human persons inside and outside the slaughterhouse. And the reason I keep saying outside is to include transport trucks, like I mentioned. And the reason this is so important for me is because the organization that I work with and that I am a co-organizer of, Toronto Cow Safe, focuses on bearing witness really of those beings trapped in these transport trucks. So the concept of bearing witness is one that Tolstoy came up with, and he said that when you see somebody who is suffering, instead of backing away from them, as is our nature as a society, draw yourself as close to them as you possibly can and offer them the help that they deserve if you can give it to them. And so what that means for us as a group is that we walk up as close to the transport trucks as we can, and sometimes we do prevent the trucks from entering a slaughterhouse for a certain amount of time. We document their conditions so that their stories may be told later. We give them food and water, and we tell them that they are loved and that their experience is worthy of being looked at, that we give them the respect of saying you matter. And spending this much time, spending years in this location, has given me access to knowledge that then pointed me in the direction of focusing on the slaughterhouse, both academically and for my own personal intellectual journey. But to stay on the plight of non-human persons, we have come to know more about their experience in these two particular slaughterhouses, as well as their experience in the transport trucks. And what you really see, what's really emphasized, is just how much like objects they are treated. They are hung upside down by one foot, and their throats are slit while they are entirely conscious. And this is done in front of their family members and friends. So they have to watch their family members slowly bleed out, and there's nothing they can do about it. They have to watch their family members scream and kick, and again, there's nothing they can do about it. They are even regularly skinned and dismembered alive, and this is because the managers don't want to slow down the kill line. Even just to provide these animals with the smallest amount of humane treatment, it is not worth slowing down the kill line, because that means less money. And to me, that really just shows how little they are thought of as persons, because they do not meet the definition of a person, because they do not stand on two legs and are not thought of as thinking rationally. And so it is not worth it to consider their needs and their feelings. They are mere objects. And when these animals come in disabled, it's even worse. Now, I'm not sure that one can ever say that these animals come in completely healthy, but when you see a dairy mom or an egg-laying hen whose body has been so ravaged over the years that they cannot stand up, you see that there are some that come in sicker than others, and these ones tend to horribly face an even worse death, because they are picked up and thrown into the slaughterhouse when they cannot walk, or they are dragged into the slaughterhouse with chains. And often because of this, they are not stunned properly, and they go down the kill line completely unconscious. And practically, for non-human persons, this is where ableism and speciesism intersects. But to now bring in to this discussion what human persons experience inside and outside the slaughterhouse, I want to first start with some specific statistics. So meatpacking has the highest rate of serious injury of any other job in North America. It is 33 times higher than the national average. This means that about 40,000 people are injured a day on the job. To give some examples of some particularly egregious incidents, that were listed in incident reports of the last few years. And what I want you to think about when I'm listing these is what didn't make it into the reports, because we know that most of what goes on in slaughterhouses is hidden from us. 8 were injured and 1 was killed after an ammonia spill. An employee was decapitated by the chain of a hide puller machine. An employee was killed when their head was crushed in a hide flesher machine. An employee was killed by a stun gun. An employee was killed by a gut cooker machine. And even though I've already talked about the violence that non-human animals face, I just want to mention that just by looking at the way that these machines are labeled alone, one can tell just how horribly these creatures are treated. But to get back to what human animals experience, I want to bring back up what I have experienced working with Toronto Cow Save. And there was one particular instance where, and we were there doing vigils multiple times a week, and there were people from one of the slaughterhouses who were protesting. They had stopped working and they were protesting because they weren't getting the disability pay they needed. And I ended up connecting with this one person who had rheumatoid arthritis, and he got this job because he felt like he had no other options. He was also not a legal citizen, and so he was promised this job where he could get higher pay than, say, in a retail setting. And so he took the job, and he has just been continually getting injured ever since. So he was once burned so poorly all down his back by a knife sterilization vat of water that he was off work for 3 months, and he did not get paid for that entire 3 months. And so not only was he not paid for something that happened to him while he was on the job, but because he was not a legal citizen, he wasn't getting paid for the medications he needed as somebody with a chronic illness. And that was actually when I first began thinking about the further connections and just the deeper connections between ableism and speciesism, and that these connections didn't just exist on sort of a theoretical level, but that they exist on a practical level for every one of the beings that enters the slaughterhouse, whether they are human or non-human, whether they enter quote-unquote willingly or unwillingly. Some further examples that I just want to get into, which show just really how ableism for the worker is ingrained in this slaughterhouse mentality. I want to first begin with the Adelissa slaughterhouse case. This was in Iowa, and it started in the 50s and was just recently legally settled. It involved a turkey growing and processing plant. And so growing means this is where the turkeys were living, if you can truly call it living, and this is where the turkeys were dying. The men were from institutions for the disabled, and they were promised a job plus housing. And this is something that people might be shocked to learn still goes on today. And we know this because the management at the slaughterhouses that we bear witness at, the Toronto Cow Save bears witness at, has told us that he goes into these institutions and he helps. He really believes he's helping. He helps these people who society has thrown away into these institutions. He helps them re-enter society by killing, and he helps them get a decent job. Again, he truly believes that. But getting back to this particular case, they were given the jobs of either the pullers or the croppers. So they had to pull out the windpipe and the crop of the turkeys in the slaughterhouse setting, and this is considered to be one of the dirtiest and most physically difficult job there is. So here you have men that are already disabled, and you're giving them a job that is pretty much guaranteed to give them further disability in the future. But I think one of the reasons it can be argued that slaughterhouse management go and they purposely look to hire people with disabilities is because either they think they will not complain because they cannot get anything else, or they think that if they do complain, that society won't listen to them. And sadly, both of those things are true. So these men ended up getting paid only $65 a month, no matter how many hours they worked, and medical expenses were taken out of their pay. So it's sort of like with the dairy moms and the egg laying moms. Now, I'm not saying that getting paid less is the same as the torture that dairy and egg moms face, but it's still an instance in which, within a terrible situation, people who are disabled are experiencing even more terror in a terrible situation. So these men were getting paid even less than those who didn't have medical expenses. And the housing they were given, basically they were given housing to share with roaches and mice. They also had soiled mattresses, and they ended up malnourished. And the reason they ended up malnourished is because the food was so horrible as a result of contamination from the rats and the roaches that they had to hold their hands over their plates so that the mice and rats and roaches wouldn't fall into their food. They also needed dental attention at the time when this case began, and almost all of them suffered from arthritis, again, as a result of the job they were given, because it was known when they were given the job that it's one of the most physically grueling jobs that there are. Another case involves the Montfort Beef Company, which is owned by ConAgra, one of the biggest agricultural institutions in the States. There was a man who could not read, and he had to have back surgery, and he needed a job to help pay for his back surgery. So this is, again, somebody with disabilities who found themselves in really hard circumstances and thus needed to take the only job they could get. But while on the job, he just ended up sicker. He inhaled too much chlorine while cleaning the blood tanks and had to spend a month in the hospital because he had burned his lungs and his skin. He damaged a rotator cuff in his left shoulder as well as broke a leg and shattered an ankle. He is now living off of Social Security. So again, we have somebody who went into this job desperately and came out even more desperate. And so I think it's really obvious that on a practical level, ableism and speciesism feed off each other in the slaughterhouse setting. And indeed, the animal agriculture industry in general is founded on ableism and violence by decisions made about who counts as a person and whose bodies matter. And right now, the definition of who counts as a person hinges on patriarchal, hetero-cis masculine abled traits. The valuing of whether or not somebody can walk on two legs and whether or not somebody is thought of as being able to think rationally. And we are deciding who, deserves a job good enough that they can make a living off of it, who deserves to be disabled, who deserves to be further disabled, who deserves to live, who deserves to die, who deserves to suffer, all based on these two arbitrary things. They're things, and instead of treating these abilities like they are like arbitrary things, we take these abilities and we say, okay, now we're gonna treat whoever doesn't have these things like things. And then we have human people and non-human people being treated like objects, and that's when they have their rights taken away, and that's when their bodies no longer see respect, and that's when violence ends up being done onto them. Preference for certain abilities over others leads to a labeling of real or perceived deviations. So this is deviations from, not being able or not choosing to walk on two legs, and being thought of as not thinking rationally, as a diminished state of being. Just like speciesism assigns different values and rights based on abilities, not being able to walk on two legs, or being thought of as not thinking rationally, and them being viewed as lesser as a result, and humans as superior. You can see how speciesism thus also promotes discrimination against persons with disabilities, as it encourages this overvaluing of the ability to walk on two legs or to be thought of as thinking rationally. Any person, whether non-human or otherwise, who is perceived as not having these desired, oh so important traits, is seen as other than human. This othering of animal persons, as well as persons with disabilities, and more individuals, such as women, makes their loss of rights and differential treatment towards them reasonable, since they are not viewed as true persons, and in fact are viewed as objects. To conclude, because the definition of the person has been defined by making claims as to what it is not, example, it is not someone who does not walk on two legs. It is not someone who communicates in a way other than the English language. It is not someone who communicates in a way that is other than rational, and it is not somebody who communicates emotionally. Persons with disabilities and non-human persons hold oppressed, subordinate positions in society, which results in them experiencing a loss of rights, and even in the violence which is perpetrated against them, as we have seen in the examples I have provided, as being viewed acceptable. Thank you.